So, hi there, Roz. How have you been?
Hi, I'm good. How are you doing? And we're back again for our next podcast. And we're breaking this into two parts today. We're going to be talking about culture and cultural influence and other issues today. So I'm looking forward to having that discussion with you today, Carmen. So, how have you been, dear?
Well, I've been busy, as you well know. Things from the school have been crazy, and personal life has been crazy as well. So that's why life has a funny way of taking over things, doesn't it?
Oh,
And
yeah.
one thing is what you plan, and another thing is what you actually do. So that's why
Yes.
we've been out of touch for a while. But here we are. And
And we're,
even though we may not be as consistent as we want to be, we're still here. So please stay in touch with us.
yes. All righty. So
Okay, so
let's
we're
get this
starting
show on
with
the
number
road.
one.
Yeah.
So, before we get started, I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. Okay.
Mhm.
And it has to do with this whole cultural aspect that we're talking about, right? Because of my Canadian and Spanish origins, I have always been interested in culture and language, particularly when, as a teenager, I moved to Spain in the post Franco era, which was not fun. I'll tell you that for nothing. So, needless to say, that the move, which initially started as an adventure, soon turned into a nightmare, precisely because of the cultural shock that I went through. I moved from an open minded, free, critical society to one of, in Vancouver, of course, to one of fear, limited expression of ideals and beliefs. I was living in Cordoba at the time, which is where my parents, the province in which my parents were from and where they wanted to go back to. My father was an activist. Fortunately, he had no blood on his hands. And even though he was in a concentration camp in the north of Africa for several years, he the aspect of his character that allowed him, well, two aspects actually of his character or his personality that allowed him to survive the concentration camps were one, that they couldn't trace any blood, if you like, no violent issues with regards to his own person.
Mhm.
And the other one was that he taught everybody that wanted to in his immediate surroundings, including his guards, etc., to read and write, because some of them didn't know how to read and write. So those were the two things that saved him, if you like. So when I moved to Spain, and with that cultural baggage, if you like, everything from the clothes that I wore to my accent, because I was born in Vancouver and because they had to emigrate to Canada because of, like I said before, his beliefs and his political stance and etc. So they all signaled me out as different, to the extent that to this day, I still think that I'm somewhat of a misfit and that I don't actually fit in to the place where I'm living. And that it doesn't just have to do with my professional environment, but also the personal environment and the family environment. Because even with regards to my immediate family, my siblings, my daughter, etc. There's something that sometimes makes me and my personality conflictive with those around me. So, having used myself as an example and explained a little bit of my background, would you like to add anything onto that before we actually start with our presentation today?
I can quite understand that from an aspect. I also was born in the United States, but my parents migrated from Trinidad and Tobago from the Caribbean. So all through my life, I also had to keep that balance of culture. And in my household, we spoke about like being American and being Caribbean all the time. So of course, in the house, if Trinidad and Tobago has its own dialect, so we would speak our dialect in the house. And my mother, when I was going to school, I would go to school and speak the dialect in class, and the teachers wouldn't understand me. So they would call my mother and say, "Oh, does she speak English?" And she's like, "Yes," because of course the British influence over the Caribbean, um, certain Caribbean islands, were, populated by the British, the French, and the Spanish, which was also Trinidad. Trinidad was first the Spanish, then the French, and then, of course, the British rule. And they got their independence in 1968. And of course, English was the language. But of course, they had the local dialect, the patois, that were influenced by French and Spanish. So I spoke a version of that at home, and I would speak the English dialect at school, and they didn't understand me. So then my mother would say to me when I come home, she said, "Speak American at school and speak Trini in the house." And so I learned how to code switch between our patois, our our English dialect that was a mixture of French words, Spanish words, English words. Um, Linguistically, and then of course American Standard English in school. And remember, my parents spoke British English, so again, when I came home with spelling words like check and color, and they would be looking at me like, "You're spelling it wrong," until then my mother says, "No, look at the American dictionary, and this is the British dictionary. Look at the difference between the two." And then
Yeah,
these simple things like trash can was dustbin,
yeah.
truck was lorry, things like that, and learning how to do that and balancing the culture. I get it. It was the culture. And I feel somewhat of a misfit in my family because I was the one born and raised in the United States, and my sisters were born and raised in the Caribbean. And they, we, even between the two us, there's a bit of a cultural misfit because I, they would look at me and say maybe I'm too American. I'm not Trinidadian enough, and vice versa. So I understand what you're talking about of that balance of culture and how that affects our identity and our assimilation and the things that we do and how we present ourselves.
I
So
agree
let's
with you
get into it.
100% because my brothers and my sister were born in
Hmm.
Spain and they transferred to Canada, whereas I was born and raised in Canada. So that was like a conflict from the get-go, right? And
Yes.
I was thinking while you were telling your story, I was thinking of an incident that we had once on the bus in Vancouver. So the three of us, my mom, my sister, and myself, were on the bus. And of course, I was bilingual. My sister was getting there because I was about six, maybe seven.
Hmm.
And so she was picking up her English because she'd been working already and such. And so, but my mom's English was not good enough yet. So they were speaking
Hmm.
in Spanish. And then somebody interfered and said, "Speak in Spanish, you foreigners." And so I turned around and I was so offended. I remember, at such a
Hmm.
young age, I was so offended. I turned around and I looked at that person and I said, "Well, you know what? We're privileged because we have two languages. How many languages do you have?" And this was like, and of course, that person was totally taken aback because they weren't expecting that response from a
Hmm.
kid, from practically a baby. But I
Hmm.
was so offended because you know mm, ways back then, and we're talking about maybe 60s, 70s. How could you
Hmm.
have such a closed mindset? And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about later on, like this growth mindset versus the fixed mindset. So anyhow, so having said that as an introduction and including our own personal experiences to start with, some of the things that we're going to talk about today are: what is culture? How does it make us who we are? And I'm definitely 100% sure that I am who I am today because I was born in Vancouver and then I transferred to Spain, because I'm sure that if I had been born and brought up in Vancouver, I would be a different person to who I am today. That difference between a growth mindset and accepting difference and being empathetic with your surroundings to the fixed mindset where this is what it is. And if you don't fit into this catalog, then you're not right, if you like to put it some way. What happens when we travel, we migrate or immigrate? And what is the difference between cultural assimilation and cultural identity? And why is there a struggle there? And then the hidden curriculum. And then I have a few questions that I've come up with to ask you, Roz, and then I hope that you ask me, and let's see how they're the same or how they're different. Okay?
Okay, sounds like a plan. And also, this is a two-part series, so we will be having this is our first part of talking about culture. And the second part, we're going to be talking about culture in the classroom and how that affects
Excellent.
learning, teaching, and
Yep,
instruction, and that
definitely.
curriculum, both the instructional curriculum, the hidden curriculum, and content standards.
Excellent. Okay, so let's move on. So, first of all, what is culture? Well, depending on culture, I have my PhD right here with me because my PhD was on culture and language in the classroom. And so I went through 25 different definitions of culture, 25 different definitions of culture from the point of view of history and the point of view of different disciplines. So I came up with the following. I found 14 different categories, if you like, of cultural definition, depending on what your ideals are, the symbolism behind culture, what the meaning of cultural is, what the social implications of a definition of a culture imply, what your beliefs or how your beliefs influence your concept of culture, how you are more or less aware of your cultural surroundings, culture with regards to behavior, with regards to your history or your inheritance and your background, culture with regards to what you learn institutionally with art, with folklore or your daily activities, culture as a way of life, culture in an abstract form, and culture speaking generally, conflictive aspects of culture, and metaphoric aspects of culture. So, one of the things that I found when referring to culture were defining it with regards to food, religion, language, music, and so on. But I think that culture is a lot more than just that. As I have listed before, that I found 14 different aspects. I think that it's not just what we see, but it's also what we don't see and what is behind us. And that's the metaphor of the iceberg, or in my case, I represented it as a tree. So one thing is the fine flowering of culture and what you see.
Mhm.
This was the definition of a First Nation. And she said the fine flowering of culture was what we saw in a tree or in a flower. And then everything that was behind that was under the ground. It was the roots of what came out. So I think her name was Minnie Kellogg. So this
Mhm.
is appreciation for her. And ways back when she already thought and was thinking of definitions of culture.
Culture. Which is interesting that you bring that up because in our part two, we can kind of talk about cultural capital, which is really from Pierre Bourdieu. And he talks about that, but he breaks it down in three different forms of culture capital. And he does talk about how religion, food, language, music define you, and then also the materialistic, like having the degrees and having the BMW car and all that, and
Yeah.
how that defines you as cultural capital, and also just the everyday uh, life, like you said, that hidden part of that makes you who you are and your belief system. So we'll talk about that in part two, and that kind of very much aligns with what you just said.
Okay. So let's move on. So how does culture make us who we are? Well, there are, as we can see in this small graph, that it has to do with our education, with our age, with our race, of course, with our income, with our ethnicity, with our gender, with our abilities or disabilities, with our sexual identity, with our economic class, and how wealthy or middle class or not wealthy or poor we are. And of course, with our beliefs, with our religion, how we've grown up, and how that has influenced us as well. And of course, we take this with us, not just to in our personal lives, but we take it to our work as well. And of course, part of that hidden curriculum is like, how much of that do we reveal without being aware of it in our classrooms? And
Hmm.
this also takes us to the difference between like a growth mindset and a fixed mindset, because there are so many people, unfortunately, so many teachers that say, okay, this is the way things are. I don't want to mm, deal with challenges. Um, if this is the way things are flowing, okay, I'm just going to go with the flow. My talents and abilities are limited, so I can't improve what I have. And so, there's no questioning, or if there's questioning, there's a limited questioning of our situation. Whereas, like, the growth mindset is all for change, learning, opening your eyes and your mind and your life and your teaching situation to what is there that is coming, or what is there that I can improve, or what is there that can help me to be a better person and a better teacher, how students can help me improve, and how getting close to them and knowing them, regardless of their cultural background or situation, or even their mindset, can help me improve as an instructor. And then that brings us to our next big point, which is the difference between cultural assimilation and cultural identity. Okay, so there's voluntary assimilation and there's forced assimilation. There's forced assimilation when the situation, your context makes you evolve to something that you really aren't, but and that you really don't accept, but that you go along with, if you like, because that's going to help you with your health benefits. It's going to help you with the political situation and what's going on in the world. It's going to help you with where you've had to adapt to if you're an immigrant, or if you're poor, or if you're a homeless person and you have to go along with the shelters or whatever. So that's one thing. And then another thing is why should you conform to this? Why should you change your identity? Why should you assimilate to the culture where you are? And we both know as an experience, because we've both lived in Riyadh, for instance, or I've lived in Dubai as well, which is supposed to be more open-minded. But in these Muslim cultures, you had to conform with their way of seeing things and doing things. You were not allowed to be yourself. You were
So that
not allowed to be to not cover. At least when we were in Riyadh, for instance, you had to cover because that's the way that they saw it. So you had to cover your hair.
so in other words, in a sense, it's like that expression that we say, when in Rome,
Do as the
do as
Romans do.
Romans do.
Exactly.
So it's that same thing that you have to simulate while you're there, to make life, what is it, more adaptable and more easy to go with the flow, basically.
Yeah.
And you go with the flow. And I
But that's
guess that
not
could be said.
fair. That's not fair, because a Muslim person should not have to adapt and not have to uncover their hair if that's not their belief when
Hmm.
they're in a situation, in a different cultural situation. As for instance, why should we wear an abaya or have to cover when we're in a Muslim context if that's not our belief? So it works both ways, doesn't it? I mean, I know this is conflictive, and I'm sure that if anybody listens to this, we're going to have all sorts of comments on this, because being empathetic and being solidary and being acceptable, or at least respecting, sorry,
Hmm.
of what context you're in, is accepting the people that are there and accepting their mindsets and accepting their beliefs. As long as your beliefs do not interfere with my beliefs, your beliefs do not interfere with my space, then there should not be a problem. I mean, each of us as individuals should have like our individual space, and nobody is anybody to interfere with that individual space. At least that's what I think.
Understandable. Understandable. And like I said, we probably will get a lot of different perspectives and points of views here in comments. But, you know, as we see it, it's sometimes you say it is what it is, and, unfortunately, some things are just the way that they are. And I'll be
I
interested to see.
understand. I
Yeah, I
understand.
would be
Yeah,
interested to
sometimes there's no
hear
other
others'
there's no
perspective.
other way. You have to conform
Hmm.
to what is around you, and you can't
Hmm.
fight against it. That's
Yep.
true. I agree.
Yes.
Okay. So, no, whoops. Let's move on to cultural
So
identity. So,
identity,
what
yes.
is exactly what is cultural identity? I know that if any of my students or any of my friends or anybody that is in my immediate circle sees this, I'm going to have all sorts of fallback on this. But I've always considered myself 100% Canadian, and I think I will until my dying day. I was born and brought up in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. In that context, I was more at school and in the environment of like a, a Canadian, British Columbian, if you like, Vancouverite environment than I was in a Spanish one. So,
Hmm.
of course, I identify more with that. And I think that the fact that I was brought to Spain against my will and I was made to stay here exacerbated that identity that I want to be Canadian. I will be Canadian until the day I die.
Which
What do
is
you
interesting
think?
that you bring. It's interesting as what you say, and like I said, in part two, we're gonna dive into that a little bit more because this is very key when it comes to when we talk about culture in the classroom, and when we talk about our Erickson's theory of adolescent development here, this is key because when we think about our classroom, when we think about how diverse our classrooms are, and we
Mm-hmm.
know how diverse our classrooms will be even more so by the year 2050, we have to think about how cultural identity and maintaining it. Are we doing what we do in the educational system of maintaining a student's cultural identity and not allowing certain cultural aspects to become barriers to their learning? Are we trying to assimilate them? And then when we think about it, when we talk about Erickson's theory, a little bit further of adolescent development, we know kids at that time develop their identity. They either are going to identify with their culture or they're not going to want to associate with their culture one way. Like you said, I'm Canadian. I'm Canadian all the way. So it's the same thing here. You developed what identity versus, and kids do that. Now, are we as educators, are we causing harm to our students by doing so? What are we doing? Are we maintaining their cultural identity, allowing them to choose or rebel and say, we have students that will say, I am this culture and I refuse to speak English in class or whatever because they want to associate with their identity. So are we harming them in some way by not fostering their cultural identity? And we'll talk more about that in part two. But that's interesting that you said that because this is key. This is key in the classroom, very
I
much so.
agree with you 100% because there are so many conflicts within the classroom that I think in a multicultural classroom that come about precisely because of cultural identity, because I want to step all over you and I want to make you be similar to my culture, and assimilate to my context.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas on the other hand, the other person is like, no way. I mean, I am who I am, whether you like it or not, and I'm going to continue being who I am. And I don't care what you say or what you do or how many times you beat me up.
Mm-hmm.
Bullying is another aspect. I'm going to continue being who I am. And so that's why we're at loggerheads, because there is no flexibility. There is no, and I think that teachers have a great responsibility in this, because we have to open that dialogue. And I think that we're so afraid because we're being so politically correct nowadays, where we're so afraid that we're going to be sued. We're so afraid that we're going to lose our jobs. We're so afraid of so many aspects, that so many responsibilities that they brought upon us, that we're afraid to actually open up and say, well, why don't we discuss this? I mean, exactly how different are you from me? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
basically, we started off being exactly the same. I mean, I'm a person, you're a person. It's not like you're from Mars and I'm from Venus. And even
Mm-hmm.
if we were from Mars and from Venus, I'm pretty sure that there would be some part where we could interconnect. And that is what we have to strive for. We have to look for that intersection where we can dialogue and we can be empathetic, and we can understand each other.
And that's great. That's exactly what we're going to be leading into the next slide, that hidden curriculum that we don't speak about all the time, and
Exactly.
how that portrays itself in the classroom as well. When we think about that hidden unspoken curriculum, teachers were responsible to teach the curriculum, the content standards and whatnot, but there's a curriculum that's unspoken of, that happens in the schools, in the hallways, in the cafeteria, in the lunchrooms, in the library. So this is key too, and I'm gonna let you
Even in
speak
the
on that.
classroom,
Yeah.
Ross, like how many times have you said something and then you've caught yourself and you said, oops, I shouldn't have said that, because
Hmm.
that is my personal opinion based on my background.
Yes,
And
exactly.
nonetheless, because we're human, and it slips. I try to be very, very careful, but sometimes, when certain things, I teach C1 too, and that's like the advanced level of English within the European framework, right? And there's
Hmm.
only one more level above me, which is the C2 level. So I'm almost at the mastery level, if you like. And so
Hmm.
we talk about just about everything. And sometimes when you're discussing and you're correcting and you're helping them with their language, etc., sometimes it's like somebody says something and you snap, because it is so intrinsic to your being that you can't help but express your own point of view, and you really just cannot not speak up for yourself and share your own personal views. And I don't know, like you said, to what extent that is beneficial, that they see that there are different points of view because there are different cultures, or should you not express your point of views and just go with the flow?
Well, I guess that's something that's going to be adaptable over time, because when we think about what our future classrooms are going to look like, we definitely need a deeper understanding here of how we foster cultural identity, how we foster those, that hidden curriculum, because it's not to say that the hidden curriculum is a negative thing. It could
No.
also be a positive thing.
Yes.
So, but how do we foster that in a way that we're not
Influencing
have
or
influencing,
manipulating the
yeah,
thoughts of our students. Yeah,
yes, our thoughts of
I
our
agree.
students, or how are we making sure that we're not affecting their identity?
Yeah,
Because it's their identity at the end of the day. It's their association, who they become, who they want to be, who they are. So how much of that are we, let's say, allowed to influence, because we're building and we're molding our future individuals of society, but at the same time, are we influencing in a negative or a bad way? How are we doing this? And being
Yeah.
cautionary there. That's the thing, finding the right balance to say.
Okay. And to end this first part of our cultural presentations and podcasts, I have some questions for you. So, do you have a cultural identity?
That's interesting that you asked me that because I identify as an American, but then I also identify as Caribbean. So it's interesting that balance because I like to say when you have these applications, they ask you your here in the United States, you're asked like, what your ethnicity is, and you check a box, and I look at the boxes and say, I don't fit any of these. I'm Caribbean American. And sometimes I will check other and write Caribbean American because that's who I feel I am. I'm not solely American because I have a Caribbean culture. I have a Caribbean dialect, my food that we eat, the way we dress, the way we dance. So I have both in a sense. So I said I'm Caribbean American. And that's interesting that you asked that. And that's how I identify myself.
So, and how did you forge that? Did it happen with you not
Gradually.
knowing, or did
It
it happen?
happened
Yeah.
gradually. As I said, as a child, like when I was told by my parents, oh, you speak American while you're in school, and when you come home, you're totally Trinidadian. Don't bring any of that American culture or aspects in the household, which was difficult to do because of course, you were listening to American music and songs, and you had American friends and, different things. So, how do you balance that? It's somehow, I think it happens naturally. It's a blend that happens. I can't even put it into words because I think we don't even realize it's happening, that we naturally blend the cultures, and we know our cultural identity from our parents and our heritage, but at the same time we're part of a different culture because we're born and raised in the United States, so we have that also, and somehow along the way they mesh together.
That's
And
interesting that you should say that. I think that the difference between you and me may be because I was made to come to Spain. I was
mhm,
underage. I was like just about to turn 18, but I was 17, and so I had to come when my parents retired and they decided to leave Canada. I had to come to Spain, and I was kind of dumped here, and I had to stay
mhm,
here. And so I think that might be one of the reasons, because my nieces and my nephew are in my same situation. Like, they were born in Canada and then they came here,
mhm,
and they haven't had like that trauma, if you like. Perhaps again, it was the social political situation. Like when I arrived at the end of the 70s, it was like the Franco era. And so
mhm,
Franco Spain was very different to the Spain that fortunately, very different to the Spain that we have nowadays, and very different to the social, cultural level, context that my nieces and my nephew came to when they decided to return, or when my brothers and my sister decided to return to Spain.
mhm,
So maybe that might be a reason. I mean, I've always thought of myself as Canadian, and maybe it's because they didn't let me go back to Canada
mhm,
for some years. Maybe that was why it was like this rebuttal to, okay, so you're not letting me go back, but the more that you make me not be Canadian, the more I am Canadian. And maybe also because I walked into a class when I was in high school, once my studies were convalidated and everything, and I walked into a class and there were these big words. I think I've mentioned this before, like Yankee
mhm,
go home, where it made me feel like totally, like I didn't belong
mhm.
with my peers, right? And I thought, like, these guys don't even know what they're talking about. I'm not even a Yank. I mean, I'm a Canuck. So
Mm,
they haven't got a clue. But I think that that made me like reinforce the fact that I was different and that I didn't belong and that I couldn't care less who was around me, that I was going to continue in like continue down my path regardless of what was around me. So I think that maybe because you were in a sense more accepted than I was, maybe your cultural identity and like you accepting both cultural identities is different too. Like whenever they ask me, are you Spanish? Or whenever anybody calls me Spanish, it's like a no, I'm
hmm
not Spanish, I'm Canadian. Like that, rejecting that
hmm
part of my personality. Like my name may be Spanish, but I am not Spanish, whether you like it or not.
Understand. I can understand that. I can understand that. But there was a level of bullying because of the way I spoke. When
Mhm.
I first went to class and I was speaking using my Caribbean dialect. So all of that, I think, and when we, in part two, how that comes out in the classroom also develops how you forge your cultures together and develop your cultural identity because, you know,
You want to
there's
protect yourself in
you
the
want to
end.
protect yourself. Yeah, you want to protect yourself and you end up figuring out how to do so.
Yeah,
It's more of it's a survival tactic
exactly.
that
Yeah,
happens. It's a survival tactic. How do I survive through my educational experience, holding on to my cultural identity and forging into what this identity and hidden curriculum and hidden everything is? That
yeah,
assimilation and acculturation that happens. So, have you ever been judged for your cultural identity? Yes,
definitely.
definitely. Definitely. And I think that a lot of people could relate to that a lot. And what perceptions do you take in your classroom to protect your students' cultural identity? As an educator here in the United States, one thing that I like to do when I go into my classroom is I try to make it a very welcoming and opening experience for everyone, no matter what your culture. And I know, like my culture, I like to know what my cultural classroom makeup is so that I can incorporate a lot of the
Yes,
things, maybe signs and symbols,
yes,
even words or phrases, things like that to make my students feel low anxiety walking into a room with, different people, different faces, multiple languages, and then all of it is represented in a
yeah.
positive light. And
And
I think
and
that's
remembering
what I do.
things that are so insignificant, but at the same time so important, like Diwali
Yes. Yeah.
or like
Eve.
Hanukkah. Yeah, just
Yeah.
asking about it, or why didn't you explain that for us? Like we don't know an awful lot
Exactly.
about it. Why don't you tell us about it?
Or
Like that is so
or
interesting, so different.
so different. Like we have students that we have circle time where we come to the carpet and we sit on the carpet and we talk about, the day. And we might have students that remove their shoes who are from the Islamic background because they know that you don't walk on the carpet. And a lot of teachers, other teachers would come to me and say, "Why did I do that?" And I said, "That's because," and I would end up explaining, and it's not a big deal. Do not make that a barrier to their learning because they take their shoes off, when they come to circle time. That's, things like that. And making sure that that is normal and okay to happen, you know, and keeping that mindset. So that kind of leads into question 5. When did you realize there was difference between fixed and growth mindset? As an ELL teacher, that has been my background as an English language learner teacher. That definitely has been a part of my years of experience having to make sure that the teachers have a growth mindset. If you speak more than one language, you're not stupid. I'm sorry, I have to put it that way, but that is the best way to explain it. These kids are actually very intelligent because they speak more than one language. And that was a growth mindset that of getting, the homeroom classroom teachers to understand that not because they don't speak English mean they don't understand, you know. They actually speak a multitude of languages, and that is actually a good thing. And that is, I remember having to get teachers to have that growth mindset with those students.
I'm
Um,
giggling because I'm remembering when I was divorced when Maria was around 11, and
mhm,
Maria and I have done so many things together and we've traveled to so many places. One of the things that we did was when I got my Fulbright year, I went
mhm,
to Billings, Montana. And while I was in Billings, Montana, Maria had already finished, my daughter had already finished her high school studies here. And it was kind of like a sabbatical year for her to,
mhm,
before she started her university studies. So, anyhow, she went back to high school. And while she was at high school, that like doing like voluntary, more than anything to reinforce her English, right? So she did some
mhm,
high school classes and she also did some university classes. And while she was in the university, she met somebody that was from another town. And so they invited her to go to this other town. So she went for a weekend, and because I knew like the young man's, she kind of had a crush on this young man, but anyhow, because I knew the young man's parents, I allowed her to go. And so they went
mhm,
to a party, and it's really funny because they were out partying and that, and they asked the young man, like, is there something wrong with your girlfriend? Is she like, like, does she have some cognitive issue or something? And Maria was like looking at them and she was like busting up laughing like crazy. And so was her at the time boyfriend. Both of them laughing like crazy. And when they finished laughing, they looked at this guy and they said, no, she's Spanish and her English skills are limited. That's why sometimes she asks you to repeat several times. And that's why sometimes when you speak fast, like her face draws a blank. I was thinking,
exactly.
yeah, it's not that I'm like mm, mm, impaired in any way. It's just that you have to give me time for me to understand like what's going on.
Hmm. That wait time, that's what we call that wait time in the
Yeah,
classroom. Definitely giving students that wait time to process from their L1 to L2 or even L3 or
yeah,
more to have that
exactly.
time to answer. And how have you developed your growth mindset? You know, as an educator, we definitely have to continuously develop our growth mindset
Yes,
because our classrooms
definitely.
are
I agree.
forever changing. They're
Yes.
changing. Change is inevitable. We learned that so much through COVID, the pandemic, because we made a transition where we were teaching online. We never
Yeah.
really taught online in a K-12 setting before. And then all of a sudden you were doing it for 2 years.
Hmm.
And you have to have a growth mindset. You had to have a growth mindset in order to adapt that. And, you know, I've seen a lot of people that have pushed back against online since COVID, you know, and in online instruction, whereas we've seen a lot of growth there. And that is also a type of growth mindset. You have to understand times are changing. The classroom is not going to be the way it was 15 years ago. It,
Yeah.
it has to change. You have to evolve with the times.
Yes.
And it's
I
in
agree.
order to be an educator, a really, I said, an effective educator, you must have that growth mindset and understanding, you know, that we're going to evolve with time. There are going to be changes we may not like, but we
Yeah.
have to evolve with it. And
I agree.
finally, have you ever caught yourself influencing your students by bringing your hidden curriculum into the classroom? Yes, I think as educators, we all do that, but we have to make sure that we're aware of when we're doing that and to stop ourselves,
Yeah.
to make sure
Yeah.
that we're not, because one of the things I like to say to my future teachers that I teach at the college level, I tell them you have to leave your biases and all your thought, you know, points of view at the door when you walk into that classroom, because you do not want that to influence your instruction in any way
Yeah.
and cause barriers to learning anyway. So you have to leave those personal opinions, that hidden curriculum at the door,
Yeah.
and make
I
sure
agree.
that you're consciously aware of your maybe your biases, or you're constantly aware of the things that are your considered your personal opinion, and know that there's a time and place for that.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, well, thank you very much, Roz. And that brings us to the end of our part one.
Yes.
And I'll see you shortly for our part two. Okay,
Alrighty. All right. Take care. See you in a few.
you too. Bye.
Bye.